The Vietnam War may have had its fair share of martyrs, but it has twice as many morons. From a slick-haired defense secretary who thought kill counts would lead to peace, to a delusional president who bombed villages while begging for hearts and minds, here are some of the biggest idiots of the Vietnam War. For our first pea-brain planner, let's roll it back to 1961. It was a time of Cold War panic, madmen suits, and punch-card computers. And sitting near the top of it all was Robert S. McNamara, the freshly appointed U.S. Secretary of Defense. A whiz kid from Ford Motor Company, McNamara had no military background, but he did have an MBA and a very strong belief in bar graphs. His big idea? That war could be solved the way you solve a manufacturing bottleneck. Numbers in, numbers out. Body counts, kill ratios, logistics models. If you could measure it, you could master it. The Pentagon transformed into a giant spreadsheet, and Vietnam became a math problem. There was just one problem. None of it worked. McNamara pushed hard for escalation, convincing JFK and then LBJ that victory could be achieved by sheer numbers. More troops, more helicopters, more bombs. From a few thousand advisors, the U.S. ballooned to over 500,000 troops by 1968. The objective? Well, no one really knew. His prize tactic, search and destroy, looked great on paper. In practice, it meant American soldiers raiding villages, counting corpses, and leaving behind smoldering resentment. Rural peasants were treated like enemy combatants, and every charred hut or body bag was just another data point to feed the machine. But Vietnam was not a factory line. It was a guerrilla war, fought in jungles, rice paddies, and spider holes, against an enemy who didn't care about metrics and didn't play by McNamara's rules. In the end, even he admitted it. Decades later, McNamara said, "We were wrong, terribly wrong." But by then, 58,000 Americans were dead, and the Vietnamese toll was in the millions. Turns out you can't spreadsheet your way out of a quagmire. We've all seen them, and we all resent them. Since the dawn of modern politics, the well-connected and the delusional have been handed power they had no business holding. In modern terminology, we refer to this special breed of tyrant light as puppet presidents, which brings us to Ngo Dinh Diem. The son of a high-ranking mandarin in Vietnam's imperial court, Diem rose to prominence as a staunch anti-communist and devout Catholic in a mostly Buddhist country. In the chaos following French colonial collapse, he was plucked from obscurity and handed South Vietnam on a silver platter, backed, funded, and propped up by the United States. Naturally, he ruled like a medieval autocrat, but there was just one problem. Ngo Dinh Diem was a paranoid control freak. Using his American backing like a blank check, he filled the government with his brothers and cousins and cronies, most notoriously his brother Ngo Dinh Diem, an allegedly opium-connected political enforcer who oversaw a vast secret police network. Diem crushed opposition, dismissed elections, and enacted Catholic-first policies in a country where over 70% of the population practiced Buddhism. And if that wasn't enough to cause unrest, his regime's corruption was so blatant it made colonial rule look organized by comparison. So what did Diem do when people pushed back? He cracked down harder. In May of 1963, South Vietnamese troops opened fire on Buddhist protesters in Hue, killing 9 civilians and kicking off the infamous Buddhist crisis. Yes, you heard that right. He literally opened fire on monks. You see, Diem's approach to governing wasn't win hearts and minds, it was rig the game and jail the losers. And there were a lot of losers, especially if they weren't Catholic. While the Viet Cong were organizing in the countryside, Diem was obsessing over loyalty oaths, banning Buddhist flags, and throwing dissidents into jail cells. Then came June 11, 1963. A monk named Thich Quang Duc sat down at a busy Saigon intersection, doused himself in gasoline, and lit a match. The image of his burning body, silent, still, unflinching, flashed across the globe. It became a symbol of Diem's brutal repression, and the world watched in horror as his government responded by blaming the Buddhist. Some say the definition of madness is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. But that could easily apply to Diem's foreign policy as well. Even as his approval ratings tanked in the White House and photos of self-immolating monks filled U.S. newspapers, Diem refused to compromise. He dismissed American warnings, shut out dissenting voices, and insisted his people loved him. And when President Kennedy finally had enough, he authorized the CIA to support a coup. Diem fled to a church for sanctuary, but the military dragged him into an armored personnel carrier. Hours later, both Diem and his brother were dead, shot in the back of the vehicle, their bodies dumped unceremoniously. The irony was, though, that Diem had always claimed to be saving Vietnam from chaos. His final years created exactly that. After his death, South Vietnam descended into revolving door leadership, political instability, and worsening corruption. The war escalated, and American troops soon flooded in to prop up the same rotten system Diem had left behind. Finally, in hindsight, even some U.S. officials admitted that backing Diem in the first place had been a catastrophic mistake, much to the frustration of everyone. Before controversy permanently clouded his legacy, U.S. Army General William Westmoreland had been the golden boy of the Joint Chiefs, personally handpicked by President Johnson to lead the war effort in Vietnam. But the ambitious and tunnel-visioned Westmoreland, who believed military victory was just a matter of math, was in no way suited for the job. He was, according to one historian, a man more obsessed with metrics than with meaningful results. In the year 1964, after being named commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, Westmoreland arrived in Saigon with a plan: kill more of them than they kill of us, and eventually they'll give up. In practice, that meant treating Vietnam like a scoreboard. The higher the body count, the closer to victory. Convinced that he could outshoot and outspend a guerrilla army, Westmoreland flooded the countryside with troops, helicopters, and M16s while claiming the war was being won by attrition. But what Westmoreland didn't grasp was that he was blindly walking into a war of endurance, not annihilation, against an enemy that had no intention of quitting. The Viet Cong didn't rely on numbers or technology. They relied on patience, tunnels, and a total commitment. And as U.S. units swept villages looking for enemies, they created even more of them. By then, the whole illusion came crashing down in one night. In late January 1968, while Westmoreland was still publicly assuring Americans that victory was near, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese launched the Tet Offensive, a coordinated assault on over 100 towns and cities across South Vietnam. In Saigon, they even attacked the U.S. Embassy. The generals in Saigon were blindsided, the politicians in Washington were stunned, and the American public, watching it all unfold on television, suddenly stopped believing a word of it. All at once, the myth of progress evaporated. Helicopters burned on runways, Marines fought house to house in Hue, and Westmoreland's carefully curated numbers looked like a joke. Even though U.S. forces technically repelled the offensive, the damage had already been done. The American people no longer trusted the Pentagon's version of reality. Knowing the narrative had collapsed, President Johnson sidelined Westmoreland and called for de-escalation. The general was quietly reassigned, his predictions discredited, and his strategy abandoned as a catastrophic miscalculation. What do you think when you hear the name Lyndon B. Johnson? If this very utterance makes you imagine napalm blast over tree lines and college kids yelling into megaphones, then you're pretty close to the truth. Over the course of one presidential term, LBJ turned Vietnam from a shadow conflict into a full-scale war, complete with hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops, nightly death tolls on the evening news, and a homeland splitting in two. His great society may have promised equality in health care, but Vietnam gave him barbed wire and body bags. But he wasn't just a Southern bruiser with a God complex. Believe it or not, Johnson passed more landmark legislation than most presidents combined. Civil rights, Medicare, education reform. It's just that when it came to war, the man couldn't tell strategy from showmanship. With this in mind, this makes the actions of Johnson all the more baffling. This thick-skinned Texan inherited Vietnam after Kennedy's assassination and saw it not as a strategic puzzle, but as a political nightmare. Terrified of being the president who lost Vietnam, he leaned into escalation like it was his re-election plan. After the murky Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, Johnson got Congress to hand him a blank check, and he spent it bombing a country he barely understood. LBJ was deeply insecure about appearing weak, but being the master manipulator he was, he tried to micromanage the entire war from Washington. His staff delivered bombing targets that he personally reviewed, often down to individual bridges and rail yards. His generals, meanwhile, were left to fight a guerrilla war with Cold War tactics and zero flexibility. And when critics started asking what victory even looked like, Johnson gave them slogans instead of answers. The old saying goes that pride comes before fall, and in this case, it was the fall of a presidency. What followed was a nationwide backlash, so intense it broke the Democratic Party in half. The war he refused to end sparked mass protests, riots, and draft dodging. Cities burned, campuses erupted. By 1968, his own approval ratings had cratered below 40%. And rather than face defeat or accountability, Johnson shocked the nation by announcing he would not seek re-election. In the end, and perhaps to his credit, Johnson died in 1973 just as U.S. troops were pulling out. But by then the damage had been done. His decisions led to over 58,000 American deaths, millions of Vietnamese casualties, and a war that tore apart the very country he tried to uplift. In total, his catastrophic overreach turned a regional insurgency into America's most unpopular war, and that's not even up for debate. There are a lot of ways to lose a war, but few manage to lose it by alienating the very people they're supposed to be protecting. The Strategic Hamlet program was a U.S.-backed initiative launched in South Vietnam in 1962, and the idea, at least in theory, was simple. By relocating rural families into fortified hamlets, the program would separate the civilian population from the Viet Cong insurgents who relied on them for food, shelter, and information. In practice, though, it quickly became one of the most disastrously counterproductive ideas of the entire war. When the program began, U.S. officials hoped to establish tens of thousands of these hamlets throughout the countryside. At its peak, more than 8 million people, roughly half of South Vietnam's rural population, were uprooted and forcibly relocated. The theory was that these new settlements would provide security, government services, and political education. The reality was far grimmer. The hamlets were poorly planned, hastily built, and often lacked basic necessities like clean water or medical care. Worse still, they were frequently placed in hostile areas without sufficient protection. In many cases, villagers were moved into barbed wire enclosures surrounded by minefields, essentially prison camps with rice paddies. Obviously, the locals weren't thrilled about this, and they had every reason not to be. Corrupt officials often skimmed funds meant for building supplies. Landlords used the program as an excuse to seize land and evict tenants. The villagers themselves received little explanation and even less compensation. The thing is, though, that these were the same people the U.S. and South Vietnamese governments claimed they were trying to liberate. And when those people saw their homes burned, their communities broken apart, and their lives upended by foreign-backed bulldozers, they didn't exactly feel liberated. They felt betrayed. Through a combination of arrogance, incompetence, and cultural ignorance, the Strategic Hamlet program had the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of isolating the Viet Cong, it provided them with a recruiting bonanza. By 1964, the hamlets were being overrun, abandoned, or turned into Viet Cong strongholds. Villagers, angry and displaced, offered information and supplies to the insurgents. In some areas, the program collapsed entirely within months. By 1965, the entire effort had been quietly scrapped, and what remained was a countryside more hostile to the South Vietnamese government than it had been before. Because there was no way to fix it, American officials simply stopped talking about it. The villages returned to chaos, the fences rusted, and the people never forgot what had been done to them in the name of security. And while the program didn't make headlines like the Tet Offensive or the fall of Saigon, its damage was no less real. It undermined the very legitimacy of the South Vietnamese government and exposed in vivid detail just how little the U.S. understood the country it was trying to save. This leads us to a lesson that should have been obvious from the start. Nothing says liberation like forcing people from their homes. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam was supposed to be the answer. With over 1 million soldiers on the books and billions in U.S. funding behind it, the ARVN was meant to carry the torch after American troops withdrew. They had American rifles, American helicopters, American uniforms, and American paychecks. But underneath the gear and the flag patches was a military hollowed out by graft, cowardice, and sheer incompetence. And at the top of it all were the generals, political appointees and career schemers who couldn't command a traffic stop, let alone a war. In theory, the ARVN had every advantage, but in practice, the men leading it were more interested in making deals than winning battles. It wasn't uncommon for commanders to inflate troop numbers to collect extra supplies, or to sell U.S. fuel on the black market while their soldiers walked into combat with empty tanks. Some of them treated their own units like personal fiefdoms, rewarding loyalty with cash and punishing dissent with demotions. And instead of building trust with local communities, ARVN officers often extorted villagers, looted property, and pocketed aid money. The whole army became a political machine dressed in fatigues. Washington knew this was a problem, but kept pretending it wasn't. The theory was that South Vietnam just needed Vietnamization, a graceful handoff of responsibility from American troops to ARVN forces. But every time the ARVN was tested, it collapsed. In 1972, during the North's Easter Offensive, entire divisions fled without firing a shot. American bombers had to be called in just to stop the bleeding, and when the U.S. finally pulled out in 1973, the generals promised they could hold the line. They even said it in press conferences. That line didn't last long, though. In March of 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched a full-scale assault. The ARVN broke almost immediately. Cities were abandoned overnight. Commanders disappeared. Some officers bribed helicopter pilots to fly their families to safety while their troops were left behind. In one infamous case, a general stripped off his uniform, disguised himself as a civilian, and slipped onto a plane. Saigon fell less than 2 months later. The old saying goes that an army is only as good as its leadership, and in this case it was the leadership that doomed the country. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into the South's capital. Helicopters evacuated U.S. personnel from rooftops as desperate civilians clung to the skids. ARVN soldiers deserted en masse, melted into the crowd, or surrendered without a fight. It was a humiliating end to a 20-year war, capped off by an army that had been given everything and still chose to run. In total, the ARVN didn't just lose a war, they helped hand it over. And for all the aid, weapons, and second chances they were given, their collapse proved one thing beyond doubt. Turns out you can't outsource your war to people who don't want to fight it. As we've seen, there were plenty of mistakes in the Vietnam War, but Operation Rolling Thunder takes the crown for a pure, explosive futility. Beginning in March of 1965, it was the most ambitious air campaign the U.S. had ever launched against a single country. The theory was simple: bomb North Vietnam so relentlessly that its leaders would beg for peace. By the time it ended in 1968, the U.S. had dropped more than 643,000 tons of explosives, struck thousands of targets, and spent billions of dollars. But instead of breaking the enemy's will, the campaign achieved something else entirely. It convinced the North Vietnamese they were right to fight. When the operation began, U.S. planners believed that sustained aerial bombardment would destroy supply routes, isolate the Viet Cong, and force Hanoi to negotiate. But the North had no intention of giving up. They didn't just endure the bombs, they adapted to them. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, which snaked across Laos and Cambodia, became a logistical miracle. When craters swallowed up roads, new ones were carved overnight. When trucks were bombed, porters carried supplies on foot. And when entire stretches of jungle were reduced to ash, the North Vietnamese just dug deeper into tunnels, caves, and fortified bunkers. Obviously, the U.S. didn't see this coming, so they escalated. They expanded target lists, increased sortie counts, and dumped more bombs on increasingly rural areas. In response, the North Vietnamese improved their air defenses. Anti-aircraft guns appeared on every hill. Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missiles took down American planes at a growing rate. And on the ground, the civilian population endured wave after wave of destruction. The thing is, though, instead of turning against their government, most Vietnamese turned against America. And back in the U.S., the nightly news delivered images of burning villages, terrified farmers, and pilots being shot out of the sky. Through a combination of arrogance, stubbornness, and poor intelligence, Operation Rolling Thunder failed on every level. It didn't stop the flow of troops or weapons, it didn't destroy North Vietnam's capacity to fight, and it didn't bring Hanoi to the table. What it did do was strengthen the North's resolve, turn global opinion against the U.S., and inflame the anti-war movement at home. The more America bombed, the more it looked like the aggressor, and the more it looked like the aggressor, the harder it became to claim any moral high ground. Because the campaign had gone so far off the rails, even U.S. officials began to question its purpose. Military leaders admitted privately that the strategy wasn't working. Intelligence reports warned that bombing was uniting, not dividing the enemy. But by then, it was too late. The damage had been done, both in Vietnam and in the court of global opinion. And when the operation finally ended in 1968, it left behind a countryside in ruins and a strategy in shambles. They tried to bomb Vietnam into submission, and all they got was more war.